All right, viewers and listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good day and welcome to an exclusive interview on my YouTube channel, Global Arena TV. I'm your host, Umar Isa Dandago. My guest today is someone I have come to admire for several reasons, one of which is indeed his kindness, but more professionally, his work. Robert Lane Greene, popularly known as Lane Greene, is currently serving as the language editor of the Economist magazine, a magazine said to be meant for the elites. And I believe Lane is also an elite. He is on the show to talk about anything language and his attachment to it. We'll also try to explore issues around language and why he has been so engrossed in writing and now making explainer videos on not just English language, but language in general. For example, issues around British versus American English and whether or not Americanism is taking over British English. I'll also ask him about how journalists use language, specifically English, in writing and in presentation, because we have been taught in class that when you come to write a news article or when you come to present a program on radio or TV, you need to use simple, straightforward language that could be understood by every person. But then it seems we have a totally different, or we have the opposite of this when it comes to the media. A lot of journalists would use very flowery language, captivating English with hard hitting, or what's the word for it? Bombastic word, if I could use this word, I don't know. Um, why does this happen? Does it mean that, okay, what we have been learning in class should now just be trashed? We do not apply it in real life? Well, there are a lot of things that we're going to discuss, and whether or not the English language has never been the official language of the United States of America until Donald John Trump came back as the 47th president. Well, Lane Greene, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
It's good to be here. So should we jump right in with the language of journalism?
Yeah, let's start with this. Definitely, even though I wanted to ask you about your biography, but however you want it.
Sure. Ask whatever you like, and I'll do my best.
All right, your biography, please.
Well, I'm American, so I work for a British magazine, but I'm American. I'm from the south of the United States. I was born in Tennessee, and I was raised in Georgia. So I didn't grow up around journalists and publishing culture. Those industries are centered in New York City, Washington, D.C., and places like that. And I was far away from that. So I feel very lucky to have kind of made a long way of a career to get into journalism, but I was very lucky to get my first full-time real job in journalism at The Economist 25 years ago this year. So it's my 25th anniversary in September at The Economist, and I
Congratulations.
started as a very junior. Thank you. I started as a very junior web editor and made my way to writing and covering the elections of 2004 and 2008, along with our big team in the United States. And then I started on a career writing in different parts of the website or of the magazine. So I have written about law. I have written about energy and the environment. I covered European business from Berlin. I had two different editorial jobs in London the last 6 years that I spent in London from 2015 to 2021. And since 2021, I've lived in Spain, where I've been the Spain correspondent for 3 years. And I am now a senior digital editor, as well as covering all issues of language. That means I decide on in-house language issues, how we spell or capitalize things, which words we like and which words we don't like and discourage, ruling on issues of grammar and things like that. And in addition, writing about language for The Economist.
Okay, so how have you found working your work for The Economist? I understand that you did not start practicing journalism at home in the United States until you crossed over to the UK. Is that right?
Well, my first job was in the US, in the United States, but for a British publication. So I started in the New York office of The Economist, which is a very British publication, and we were mostly British journalists in the office, with a minority of Americans at the time.
So how has it been like, for example, especially during that time when you started working as an American, but working for a British publication? How did you deal with the differences between the British and American English in terms of especially spelling and grammar, since it's a magazine, not a broadcast station?
Yeah, that's a great question. I happen to have just come from doing a master's degree in Britain. So I did, I just kind of soaked up British English from the radio, from reading. When I would write my papers in the UK, I can't even remember if I wrote them in American or British spelling and style, but I think I gradually started writing in more British English at that time. So by the time I started at The Economist, I had been marinating in British English for a couple of years. And so I was pretty ready to start writing in British English. But that said, 25 years later, I still learn new things about the differences between British and American English. I'm still surprised when someone says this is an Americanism. We can't do that in the pages of The Economist. And they're now quite subtle things, all the obvious things I learned a long time ago. But the subtleties are very, very many, and I keep learning them. So that's one of the fun things about being a journalist is you keep learning new things.
All right, that's fantastic. So now what I want to understand is that now, at the Economist, what's the in-house style? What's your style, for example? Are you strictly using, or are you strictly supposed to use the standard British English? Or there's no problem if someone like you as an American, understandably, uses American English or mixes both?
Right. No, the standard is actually British English. So strangely enough, I am American, but I'm also the author of our style guide. So I am the person in charge of our style, but I am enforcing a British style to colleagues who are British, who are American, and who are from other countries as well. And we have quite a lot of journalists from other countries. We have one Nigerian correspondent. We have people from Germany and Australia and Canada and France and all over the place. Um, we do write in British English. It's part of the brand of The Economist. It's a London-based publication. It was founded there 182 years ago. In an American marketplace, we sell more than half of our copies in the United States, not in Britain. So it's our biggest market. The British language of The Economist helps us stand out because we don't look just like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. So it's partly a branding difference, and we like it. It's just part of our heritage. So even I, as an American, I can be proud of my own language and still be the arbiter of a good British style when I sit down in my chair as the economist.
Oh, that's fantastic. So as an American, you don't feel restricted, caged, or even forced to use British English.
No, now I will say there's one exception, which is that when we're writing about the United States from within the United States, it can be a little strange to refer to a motorway rather than a highway or a lorry instead of a truck. So in the United States pages, when someone's reporting from the U.S., we give ourselves a little leeway because in some case terms, so especially some of the very symbolic and famous ones like lorry, in the United States section, when the word truck driver is such a common word, so we say truck driver occasionally rather than lorry driver. Run America to write in British English because that might be odd. But when I'm writing about something else, if I'm writing about science or if I'm writing about language, most of the differences are in spelling and they're fairly small. And I have gotten used to them. That's writing OUR at the end of words like color and honor. It's writing RE in words like theater and center. I've been doing it for 25 years, so I'm pretty used to it by now, and I don't feel too constrained by it.
All right, let's go back a little bit to the beginning of your life. How did you pick up your passion for and knowledge of language or languages, for example? How did it start?
Yeah, it started very late for me, I think. Maybe in contrast to some people, I didn't grow up internationally or traveling and living in different languages. I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, which is quiet and very English speaking, I'd say mostly monolingual. I had a Korean American friend, and I had an Indian American friend, and I had a couple of 5% sort of white English speaking. And so it was a pretty homogenous area. But what actually happened is that I fell in love with Spanish class. I just was good at Spanish. I got good grades. I enjoyed it. I found it easy, and I found it fun. And something about it, exactly. But as a result, it became something I specialized in. It was my best subject in school. And when I went to university, I had the chance to learn another language. And so I chose German because it's not so closely related, and I wanted to do something different. And I spent a year of my 4 years in Germany, studying in Germany. And then I started French, and then I started Portuguese, and then I started Russian, and then I started, it was like a ball rolling downhill where I just did more and more and more languages. And so I just came to enjoy it more and more, is all I can say.
So how old were you when you started learning other languages, foreign languages?
Yeah, very late. As I say, we started in my school system. We started when I was 14, which I think is way too late. It would have been much better to start at, age 7. And most school systems now, especially, start teaching English very, very young. My wife, who is Danish, started learning her English when she was in, second grade, so probably 7 or 8 years old.
Mm.
We start much later. It's in the middle of puberty. It's not a time when you want to embarrass yourself in front of your friends and your classmates by making crazy sounds that you've never made before and all that. So it's really a bad time to start. I guess I was lucky that I liked it, but I'd say the great majority of kids in my Spanish class cannot speak any Spanish whatsoever today.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of your wife, I was doing a research about you and I got to know her name. It's a Danish name I cannot pronounce, but then there's Greene at the end of the name. And I watched a clip of a video introducing one type of NGO she's working for, and her English is absolutely stunning, fantastic to be honest with you, and that's great.
It's remarkable how in Northern Europe, I'd say the Scandinavian countries, the Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and then also the Netherlands, Iceland, a couple of other places, the level of English speaking is not just good, it's not just professional and accurate. They speak like native English speakers. They speak like I do. And it's really becoming so deeply ingrained that I would start to call those bilingual societies where the people are functionally not just capable in English, they're bilinguals. They're true native like bilinguals. I met a friend of mine, a friend of Ava's daughter, was a 10-year-old girl who had never been inside a perfect American accented English that she had learned from YouTube.
Wow.
So
And she has
really
never been to
remarkable.
the US.
Never to the US, never to Britain, never to any English speaking country. She just taught herself. My son here in Spain, where I live, he's a Danish bilingual, so he speaks English and Danish as well as Spanish. But this girl who visited him, preferred to speak English with him because she wanted to practice.
Yeah,
She'd never met a native English speaking boy and wanted to speak English with him. And when I heard her speak, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that she'd never been to an English speaking country. So it just goes to show how deeply rooted English has become in some of those countries.
and I think this shows how hugely significant it is for someone to marry to marry a wife from another tribe that speaks a totally different language. So he, if he is interested, can also learn our language, and also their kids can grow up as multilinguals, right?
Yeah, and in a lot of cultures, as you'll know, people are encouraged to marry outside of their tribe, their village, their linguistic group, and so it's weird that the richest countries in the world are very monolingual. Most Americans, most people in Britain, speak only one language. And in poorer parts of the world, places like India, you'll get people who are quite poor who speak 4 or 5 languages brilliantly. And so I think it's wonderful. It's one of the subjects I want to study and report more on is the multilingualism of places in Africa, in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, because people have to speak 4 languages just to kind of get around their local area, which
Yeah,
I think
sure.
is fascinating.
So for now, how many languages do you speak? Because there was a time when I was watching one of your videos and you said about 7 to 9, but you're not sure whether
Yeah.
the last two languages are as fluent as possible. But then explain to us how you came to learn or how you have come to learn all these 7 or 9 languages.
Yeah, well, without telling like all I mean, English is my native language, so that we know that one. I mentioned Spanish, French, Portuguese, Russian. I did in college and got to a certain good level with each of those. And then after college, I met my Danish speaking wife, so I learned Danish with her. After September 11th, 2001, and the terrorist attacks in New York City, I decided one thing America needed more of was more Arabic speakers to understand and deal with the Arab world, and spent many years actually working very hard on my Arabic, and got to a pretty medium high level, not high, but what I could carry on a half an hour session with my tutor, never speaking English and working like that. And then I taught myself Italian at one point, just for fun, because I figured it would be easy. So at that point, the video that you're talking about, I would say I spoke all those languages pretty well, but Arabic and Russian were the hardest ones, and I'd spent the least time in those places. And so I'd had the least kind of practical experience getting better and more polished and more comfortable. That's why, they're sort of on the borderline. As it happens in the last 6 months, I've been spending a lot of time with my Russian, trying to improve it again. So I'd say now I'd put that back in the list for sure and say I can speak Russian, but I need a couple of months with native speakers, and I would be very happy. But I just need that time,
Yeah,
and it's harder to come by. Whereas living in Western Europe, I can spend a lot of time in France and Denmark and in Germany quite easily, and I do.
definitely. So if you are to learn a new language, okay, what sort of procedures do you follow? Do you get a tutor to teach you, or you just go on YouTube and watch YouTube videos?
I like a good book actually, and the reason is that now that I've spent so many hours learning languages, I'm pretty good at self-teaching. Not everyone is, but I'm motivated and I like it, and I understand how languages work. So I know how to kind of break it down and say, okay, how do I make questions? How do I negate something and say I am not something something? How do I make subordinate clauses like that was the cat who ate my lunch, and things like that. They're basic building blocks of every language, and I'm pretty good at figuring out what I don't know and getting through the basics myself. I can do that fast enough that I would do that first, and then I would get a tutor or a teacher when I had gotten to a point where I now wanted to start putting finer points on it, or getting that person to explain difficult points to me, things I couldn't figure out myself, or things that I'm having a hard time internalizing. Every language has its challenges. The Russian verbs of motion are incredibly complicated. I could use a teacher to really help me know when I say, I won't even get into it, but they're very complicated. You have to learn about 18 verbs to say go, which is one verb in English.
Right.
So I would love a tutor for that kind of thing. But I typically work by myself for a while before I jump in with a tutor. And then I want to be able to converse. So I like having just the chance to talk with the tutor in the language. So they don't have to speak English with me, but hopefully I want to get to a point where we can start speaking their language right away.
That's fantastic.
And I've
So
got good online tutoring services. So I use one called italki to find tutors for Italian, for Spanish, for Catalan, which I've been learning when I'm in Spain, and for Russian. So I've done tutorials in all four of those with italki.
yeah, great. So if someone wants to be like you, a multilingual, a journalist specializing in languages, what sort of advice would you give to them?
I mean, you can nowadays really surround yourself with good tools. I'd say get a book because I really do like having the grammar explained to me in English. Some things you're never going to figure out on your own if you don't have a good grammar
Mm.
book. But also take advantage of podcasts, YouTube, Duolingo, flashcard apps. There are now just dozens of tools, and you should really try to use all of them because they do different things for you. Flashcard apps like one called Anki will repeat flashcards with what's called spaced repetition. So you'll get a word a few minutes later, and then quite a few minutes later, and then an hour later, and then a week later, and then a month later, and so on. So that spaced repetition helps you remember. But once you start getting better at a word, you don't need to be reminded so often. And I find those really good, but they all do different things. Duolingo is okay; it's not amazing, but it keeps you working. There's the little owl that reminds you to take your daily lesson, and you'll just get a little bit of practice, even if it's 4 minutes. It's better than nothing.
Mm.
So I think you're not gonna get fluent with Duolingo on its own, but it does keep you motivated, and that keeps me doing other things. Right now, like I said, I'm working on Russian, so I'm reading short stories and I'm working through a grammar book again and such like that. So don't try to pick up one tool, I guess is my advice. I would surround yourself with these many tools, many of which are free. Duolingo has a free tier. Anki, I believe the flashcard app has a free tier, and of course, there's so much great YouTube. They're free podcasts. There's a series called Easy Catalan, Easy Russian, Easy Spanish, Easy Italian. You could just listen to two hosts have a conversation. And they're not speaking very slowly and making it super easy. They're having a natural conversation, but at a reasonable speed, and they're speaking nice and clearly. But they're talking about things like what really annoys you, or what foods do you like, or what are your vacation plans this year? And they're having a natural, real conversation. So you get to hear people really speaking the way they actually do. And I think that's a great series too. So there's three free tips:
Yeah,
Duolingo, Easy Something, and the Anki app for words.
yeah, great. So, have you ever been a foreign correspondent in your life?
Yes, in fact, I mean, I've been for the last 3 years. I was the correspondent for Spain, as the Economist's Europe correspondent based in Madrid, and on our business pages, I was a foreign correspondent in Germany, where I covered European business.
Okay, so okay, what advice would you give to someone like me who wants to grow up and become a foreign correspondent in the future, and versus the significance of understanding many languages to a foreign correspondent or someone who wants to become a foreign correspondent?
I think early in your career, it's probably a good idea to specialize a little bit. So I did my master's in European politics, and that was something that gave me a little bit of an edge getting into journalism because I knew a lot about individual European countries and I understood the European Union, and we did European history and economics and various issues. So that doesn't mean that you have to be limited to Europe for the rest of your career, but in early career, it's very good because it means that when you apply for a job, your editor or whoever hires you will remember you for something. Will say, "Oh, you're the guy who knows a lot about Europe, or a lot about Africa, or a lot about Latin America," and that can really help you get in. So you don't need to specialize in one country, but at least maybe one region is very good. And there's some regions that are undercovered. I mean, Africa is undercovered, Latin America is undercovered. There are a few people who really have a good expertise, and so that could really make you stand out. And if I were covering Africa, I would learn Swahili or one of the big languages so that you can range around quite a bit. Hausa, as you say, big language. Africa is a big enough population that there's quite a few big languages. You have Amharic in Ethiopia. You have some really major languages. But I understand Swahili is fairly easy to learn. That might be just a good one to. A friend of mine learned Swahili in America just because she was told it was the easiest language that they taught at the university.
Wow,
So
that's fantastic.
she
And
got and she got quite good at it actually.
wow, that's fantastic. How does your understanding of languages help you in the course of your work? First of all, starting with the columns that you started writing about language, and now the videos, the explainer videos that you started making. I understand that most of the videos that you've made about language or languages in general have emanated from the columns that you have written, right?
Yeah. That's a big question. It's hard to answer briefly, but I mean, I definitely wouldn't try to do what I've done without the languages I've studied because if you can imagine trying to cover northern Nigeria without speaking Hausa or one of the languages, and how hard it would be to really understand people, what's on their mind, what kind of music they listen to, what families are like, what friendship groups are like. You can watch the news in English. I'm sure there's plenty of great stuff in English in Nigeria, but to really understand people's daily life, you have to get closer and hopefully get to their native language. Nelson Mandela is famous for saying that if you want to reach someone's brain, you speak to a language they know, and if you want to reach their heart, you speak their native language to them. And I think that being in Spain, I just don't think I could understand Spaniards if I didn't speak Spanish. I could ask translators or read English language media from Spain or hang out with mostly English speaking Spaniards. But you really couldn't get at the heart of what drives people if you can't just flip on a TV and watch the news debates. It would be impossible to cover America without knowing English. I always tell my American friends this. So why would you think that you understand Germany if you don't speak a word of German? So I stress this a lot. I mean, I'm obviously proud of it. I enjoy it, but I also think it's incredibly important. So everything I know about Spain as a reporter has come through the Spanish language. I just think it's a tool that you can't really. It's hard to do without.
Okay. Just in a few seconds, how hard or difficult, I mean, how easy or hard is it for a grown-up person to learn another language?
Yeah, that depends on two things, at least two things, maybe three. One is the person's, there's probably an innate talent that some people are better at than others, just as some people are better at music or tennis. Um, you can't do much about that. And then there's the amount of time and focus you dedicate to it. And I think that no matter how your talent level is to start with, if you spend both time and really focus, when I say focus, I mean try to surround yourself with the language as much as possible. When you're walking down the street, try to speak it to yourself. When you're making your shopping list, make it in Russian. Do things like that. Then if you kind of surround yourself with as many opportunities as possible, you'll do better. Um, but the older you get, it can get more difficult. A lot of researchers think that it gets more difficult after roughly puberty, so the ages of sort of 10 to 15. That's what they call the critical period when you're young. Your brain is most receptive to learning a language, and after that, it gets more difficult. And the third thing I mentioned is just the language you're learning. If you're an English speaker learning Swedish, it's relatively easy because they're closely related. If you are learning Mandarin Chinese, then it's going to be hard because there will be very few words that look familiar. There is a tonal system to Mandarin, as there are to many other languages in the world, that English and European languages don't have. So if you don't have tones, it's very hard to learn them, especially if you're 49, like I am. There's the writing system, which is quite forbidding and so forth. So it depends a lot on the distance the language you're learning is from your language. If you're learning a closely related language, the challenges are going to be much easier. If you're learning something halfway around the world from a very different culture, that is going to be a lot harder. I just don't think there's any way around that.
Yeah, I recently had an interview, a debatable, a fiery interview with a professor here in Kano, and he challenged me. We talked about the use of mother tongue in developing a nation. Let's have a listen to what the kind of debate that we had.
Country cannot develop educationally, scientifically, and technologically using foreign language. You just can never. And I'm not aware of a country which has really been developed using foreign language.
Foreign language. So two important explosive points here. A country cannot develop using a foreign language. And the second point he said, I'm not aware of any country that has developed using a foreign language. As an English person, how do you feel? Do you feel like your language has been imposed upon us by your people, by your leaders, in order to continue carry on with the colonialism?
It definitely was imposed by colonialism in the past, and the British Empire and America has been kind of pushy with English language as well. I'd say today we're kind of living with the inertia of that. The past colonialism has made English the most useful language in the world, and so today the pressure is just economic. And I think we don't need to force it on people today because they sort of force it on themselves by fearing that if they don't learn English, they'll be cut out of global markets and global exchange of research and knowledge base and stuff and such. And so, I think we're living with the legacy of colonialism is a strong way to say it.
Okay. Okay. Do you agree that there is no country that has developed using a foreign language? Can you remember anyone?
Well, I'm not an expert, but I think I wouldn't say that's 100% true. I mean, lots of countries have developed with sort of elite languages that were not spoken by the people. Most of the scholarship and writing and everything in Europe was done in Latin for centuries after Latin was not spoken as a native language by anyone. Universities were conducted in Latin and so forth. So that was where the language of elite life, church and university primarily, were in Latin. But for a more modern example, I'd look to India and say that even though India has a huge number of native languages, that English is the language of business, of technology, of sort of ambition in India, and it also is a neutral language between North and South, between speakers of Hindi and say Telugu or Gujarati or Marathi or whatever you have. And so I think India is a partial example today of a country that is, though it's not giving up on its native languages, people are very proud of their languages, extremely proud of their languages. In India, they get the benefit of globalization to some extent as well when universities, publishers, authors, journalists, and so forth also use English.
So, okay, your message to Hausa people and Africans is that they should value their mother tongue, their first
Absolutely. My mission to everyone is to value mother tongue. No, there's not an insufficient mother tongue in the world. There's not a language in the world that can't be made capable for science and research and journalism and politics and everything else. So absolutely.
Okay. Len Green, once again, thank you very much indeed for sticking around. I think it's important for me to ask this question. First of all, at class, when we are in university, we've been taught seriously that whatever we are doing, whatever journalistic output we are putting out to the public, we need to make sure that the language we use is straightforward, simple, and easy to understand by each and every member of the audiences. But then I have recently found out and discovered that journalists have tended or tend to have deviated from this kind of convention. Probably they have just decided to drop it right at the gate of the universities when they are graduating or something like that. I'm not criticizing anybody, but then let me play a very short clip for you from one of my favorite English journalists, Andrew Muller, currently working for Monocle Radio. I don't know whether you know him. He's an Australian journalist.
Yes,
He's an Australian journalist working for Monocle Radio in London.
Yes, imagine choosing to associate with this tin pot tyrant who spends his days seething in the fortified citadel in the heart of his hermit fiefdom, beset by paranoid fantasies and obtuse grudges, generally reviled, admired only by obsequious power worshippers, certifiable dingbats and or Donald Trump, isolated from his peers, probably more frightened of his own associates at home than his many enemies abroad, periodically threatening a baffled world with atomic Armageddon. You really do have to wonder about the company Kim is keeping. Thanks, I'm here all week, try the borscht, and so forth.
So this is one of my most favorite explainers of not Ross Atkins, Andrew Muller. And when I hosted him about a year ago, I played this clip to him. And I said, Andrew, it took me about a week before I was able to understand your description of Kim Jong-un when he visited his friend Vladimir Putin. Personally, I like it when I see someone playing with the language, using flowery, captivatingly attention-grabbing language in writing and or especially in speaking. But then a lot of people are criticizing those using this type of language. I don't know. What could you say about this phenomenon?
I mean, that clip, I think we could agree that is entertaining. You know, it's a journalist having fun and winding himself up and winding the audience up a little bit. If you're trying to convey information, if you're really just trying to be read and understood, I wouldn't write like that. And I think that that's no criticism of what he's doing, because what he's doing is not primarily informing. That is meant to entertain right there. So I think there's a place for that kind of language. I find when I read Spanish media, for example, that I find the news pages easier to read, and I find the columns and the opinion pages harder to read, because the columnists, especially individual columnists, they try to allow themselves flights of fancy and using fancy language and unusual expressions and historical references, and you name it. So in news writing, I think the prescription is still quite clear. You should be straightforward. You should use short sentences. That was, for example, a single very long sentence, I think, in the clip that you just played. I think it was all one sentence, although very long. Short sentences make everything easier to read. It makes it easier for non-native speakers to read. It makes it easy for people still mastering the language to read. My child is 12, so he's not used to reading extremely long sentences, but he can read The Economist and does. So I think that I would still say common words that everyone uses, short sentences that are easy to unpack, and where you use things like historical, literary, artistic references, keep them light, keep them universal if possible, or at least very common. Not everyone has heard of all of Shakespeare, but it's better to stay with Shakespeare than some very small author that only very few people are familiar with. So I do think, in conclusion, it is best to keep it simple. And my style guide for The Economist preaches this over and over and over again: common words, short sentences, and clarity above all.
But there are some people, or a group of people, that would not be attracted by your columns, your articles, or your presentations if it happens to be an audio or video one, unless you sprinkle all those captivating vocabulary.
Well, so we give ourselves a little bit of leeway here in that we have columnists in the Economist. So even though their name isn't on the page, they have pseudonyms. So we have a columnist who's called Lexington in the pages, and one who's called Badgett in the pages. But those people are freer to be a little more playful and to have a little more personality. So the idea is we mix a bit, just like an ordinary newspaper will have the straight news and also columnists. We try to do a bit of that as well. So the columnists can often be funny or literary, or in other ways, depart from the very, very, newsy, straightforward style. So we try to give readers a bit of both, a bit of entertainment, but also nice, clear language that they can walk away understanding.
Okay, two major things before we wrap it up. I have worked for a guy called, now he has recently finished his PhD. His name is Anas Kampa. Now we'll call him Dr. Anas Amina Kampa. Congratulations to him. And he taught us English, and we have worked for him, taught at his school. And one thing that he has kept telling us about learning English is a concept of total immersion. And I think you would pronounce it as immersion in America, right? What do you understand by this, or what would you say to me and my friends who are teaching English and our students who are learning English about this concept of total immersion? Does it mean somebody should just dive deeply into the ocean of learning English, including the culture of the English people, or what specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I guess different people will mean different things by immersion, but I would say something like what I said before, which is when you're working on improving a language, do it from every angle. Listen to a podcast, watch TV shows, listen to music. Almost all, popular music on, say, Spotify from a big major artist, you can Google the lyrics of the songs you like online and then sing along. You may not be musical, but music is a great way to learn the rhythms of a language, and it's a great way to learn expressions that people use in speech that are not commonly taught in classrooms. So I think that's a great way to do. Netflix is great. You can watch shows in, I don't know how many languages Netflix has produced movies and TV shows in, but it's in the dozens. I mean, you can find small language content on Netflix, and you can certainly find plenty of material in French, Portuguese, Spanish, to say nothing of English. So we watch lots of Spanish Netflix, my wife and I, just to improve our Spanish. And that's a great way to immerse yourself because it's also cultural. We watch shows set in Madrid. We watch shows about people kind of like us because that helps us learn the vocabulary that people like us use.
Oh, that's fantastic. I put it on my WhatsApp status asking people to send me questions because I was going to host you on this show. And one of the people that sent in their messages replied to me is Nasiru Musa, and he said, my question is, why do Americans sound the way they sound while speaking? And one interesting thing about this guy, Nasiru, and his friends is that they have a group here in Kano, a variety of groups of young people wanting to learn American English. And some of them identify themselves with names like Obama, Americana, this and that. And they get a lot of criticisms from other people around saying that, hey, you should not learn American English. And some of them are confused. What type of English should they go for? The British one taught at schools, or the American English that they're very much interested in and they're consuming from movies, CNN, music, and so on and so forth?
Well, that's a lot of questions there, but I would say why American English sounds the way it does is a really complicated question because there are many features of American English. There's the fact that we use the letter R at the end of words like car, where a British person would say car. And the reason for that is historical. America was largely settled when most people in England still pronounced that R. So we actually keep the older pronunciation of the R, and people in the southeast of England around London stopped pronouncing it. So at the time of Shakespeare and at the time America was settled, some of the features of British English at that time settled in America, and then they changed in Britain. So the real question is, why do the Brits speak the way they do? Because we kept the old ways. Most of the vowels, there's a famous distinction between the words path and bath, or path and bath, in parts of England. And in the north, you'll get the vowel path and bath. Well, that used to be in the south of England as well. So the question is not why Americans say path, but why the British in the southeast of England, the southeast English, started saying path and bath. That's actually the innovation. So in some cases, we keep older features. In other cases, a lot of Northern English speakers came to America, and so they influenced the English language the way they did. A lot of American English is affected by the immigration to the United States in various ways, from various places and circumstances. Black English from slavery through to the colonization of much of the South. It has been a huge influence on standard American English, from slang and cool expressions. It often come from Black American English. We use syntax that comes from Yiddish, from Chinese, from German, and many other languages because their speakers came to America. So it's a really complicated question, but there is a lot of influence. But some of the most famous features like that are at the end of words. Those are actually old English features from England that persisted in America, and they changed in Britain. So you have to ask the British speakers why they speak the way they do.
So what's your message to those young people who aspire to speak American English here in Canada?
I mean, if you are interested in being in connecting with America, learn American English. If you want to live in America or travel to America or get to know America, best to learn American English. Not because it's better. If you're interested in Australia, it's good to learn Australian English and the accents and the vocabulary and the peculiarities of Australia. If you're interested in Britain, same thing. I think internationally, there's a kind of British English is somewhat losing ground, and American English is gaining ground.
Yeah.
And
the British
so,
people are envious.
yes, they are, and there's a lot of heartache about that. But I think that international speakers of English are increasingly just speaking their own way. There's an Indian variety of English, and there's a Nigerian variety of English, and there's a variety that's only spoken kind of in the European Union between diplomats who work at the European Union. So there are lots of international Englishes now, not just British and American, but Irish and Australian and South African, and then non-native varieties that are growing and growing. More people speak English as a second language than as a first language. So they're going to increasingly have a vote in how the English of the future sounds and looks like.
And what do you say to the critics of those young people who try to dissuade them from learning American English? Listen to what someone sent to me. She says, and I quote, "What's so special about American or any English for that matter? The most important thing is for young people to learn to speak and write correctly and fluently."
Right. There's two things happening here. We're talking about culture on one hand, I think, and then the language structures itself on the other. People who are speaking with an American accent or learning American English are probably signaling something like they find American culture attractive or interesting. They want to be closer to it. They want to understand it better, and they kind of want to be identified with it. So we're not really talking about American English as such. We're talking about America and American culture. And, regardless of political changes, there's a lot of things about American culture that have been attractive to people, from music to television to film, and so I think people are signaling probably that they like America, or they like American culture, and they like Americans. That's no bad thing. They can like Britain too. That doesn't bother me. They can like Australia. They can like Ireland. They can like Nigeria. And all of those are great. So if people like my country or like my people and my culture, I'm happy because I like them myself.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's what we call soft power in international relations. And I really find it fascinating. Well, I don't have to take too much of your time. It's been a huge pleasure, Lane Greene, not because I have exhausted all my questions, but because I really want to allow you to go and continue or pick up from where you left off with regards to your work and the incredible amount of work that you're putting out to the public. What can you say about this show, about me, about the interview, the questions I've put to you?
Well, I think it's great that you're doing it. I think it's great that technology like YouTube allows people to be just entrepreneurial and start their own shows, and I'm inspired that you've done it. And I think it's really wonderful that people from different corners of the world are doing it. We hear a lot from America, we hear a lot from Britain and France and Spain, and I love learning about places that I don't know much about. So I'm inspired to see people raising their voices from Africa, from Latin America, from South Asia, and so forth, and it's only to the good. I'm glad that technology has, to some extent, democratized who gets to host a show and who gets to host an interview. So I'm very happy to be here and very happy to be part of it.
Yeah. So a little bit of assessment of my language. What can you say about the way I speak English?
I would have said, I see someone very comfortable and very fluent and very confident in English. Throughout this interview, I would just say that I haven't noticed any difficulty with your English at all. I would say you're someone who is at home in the language. Obviously, an accent that is distinctive to Nigeria, but as I say, that's just more and more normal. There are more native accents today than there ever were. There are native speakers of English who live in India who've spoken English as their first language all their life, and that's part of the democratization and the spread of the language. And I think that's great too. I love to see people embracing it, and ideally, I'd love to talk about Hausa more one day because I think it's super important that people embrace their native tongue, their mother tongue, and their identity, as well as taking advantage of the international possibilities that a language like English provides.
Thank you very much indeed, Len Greene, for sparing your precious time to speak to me on my show, and extend my greetings to the family. And I'm looking forward to more of such contacts, connection. And whenever you need anything about Hausa language or anything about Nigeria, you can count on me.
Thank you very much, Umar.
On behalf of everyone that has contributed to the production of the show, my name is Umar Isa Adendogo, saying goodbye and see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, good. So.